This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This Thanksgiving and campaign season, historian Ron Formisano talks about how income inequality hampers economic growth for all. Political scientist Arthur Lupia explains why otherwise intelligent people can be so ignorant on political issues. And Bill Press talks with New York Daily News reporter Cameron Joseph about the NRA's support of terrorism. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Noted historian Ron Formisano compares income distribution and inequality in America to Pakistan, Uruguay, Nicaragua, Guyana, and Venezuela. And the comparison is not good. And we say hello to Ron Formisano, William Bryan Chair, Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Kentucky, and an expert in U.S. political culture and politics. And his latest book, Plutocracy in America, How Increasing Inequality Destroys the Middle Class and Exploits the Poor. Ron Formisano, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Jim, I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
And well, you're quite welcome, and it's our honor to have you, of course. You know, you call the United States a banana republic without the bananas. What do you mean by that?
Well, let's qualify that just a little bit, because my former colleague in the University of Kentucky History Department, a scholar of Latin America, admonished me once for using that pejorative of Central American republics. So what I actually wrote was this, quote, "Given the yawning chasm in the United States between rich and poor, in an ironic tryst from the Colossus of the North looking down on its neighbors to the south, the United States could well be called a banana republic, even though bananas are not grown here. In fact, income distribution in the United States is now more unequal than in Latin American countries such as Uruguay, Nicaragua, Guyana, and Venezuela," unquote. That's from my book. And if you really want to be depressed, income inequality in the United States is worse than in Pakistan. Not a banana republic, but hardly a country the United States should be worse than in anything under the sun.
Well, let's talk about the comparison between the U.S. and other industrialized nations in terms of income or wealth inequality. Where does the United States stand?
Not very high, and unfortunately, I do think this is an area that while the American public is increasingly aware of inequality, they just don't know how badly we stack up against other countries. Since the 1970s, the growth of income inequality in the United States has outpaced other advanced nations. In the United Kingdom, inequality has increased, for example, but at about half the rate of the U.S. And it's grown faster here than in most other European countries. Looking at wealth distribution, the United States is now the most unequal of all advanced economies. 75.4% of wealth is owned by the richest 10%. For comparisons, Canada, it's 57%. Australia, it's 50%. The UK, it's 53%. Now, some European countries have higher concentrations of wealth than that. But the U.S. is now in a class with India, Indonesia, South Africa, which has 84% concentration. And even more extreme are Kazakhstan, Russia, and the Ukraine. And the U.S. is not in their class yet, but heading in their direction, not Canada's. So it looks bad.
That's pretty startling when you put the specific numbers to it. Are there actually examples of countries raising taxes and increasing social benefits without harming the economy?
We know this about reducing taxes. Let's start with that on the wealthy.
Okay.
That is lowering the top marginal tax rates. That is what I call the fraud of supply-side economics. The effect on growth of reducing taxes on the wealthy is insignificant, but it does result in huge deficits and an increase in inequality. That we know, that has been done. In contrast, substantial research suggests that raising top rates reduces inequality and can promote growth. A 2014 International Monetary Fund staff report, now they're members of the IMF, but they're not speaking for the IMF, just to be clear, concluded that inequality was associated with a nation's slower economic growth, and that carefully managed redistributive policies would not inhibit but promote growth. So, to repeat, the higher inequality in a country, the slower the economic growth. Researchers at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 34 nations, including the United States, originally formed to promote the welfare of all those nations and people around the world, has concluded that redistribution via taxes and benefits does not retard economic growth. Sweden is a good example of a country that has raised tax rates and enjoyed growth. Sweden has a remarkably egalitarian society that through big centralized institutions makes large-scale transfers of wealth that are usually provided on a universal basis. And that's very important, a universal basis. Not singling out, not using means tests, and not being income related, with a view to reducing inequality. And that makes those programs extremely popular, and they enjoy enormous support throughout all sectors of Swedish society. Oh, and do you know about the study that shows Americans think they live in Sweden? Let me explain. These two professors interviewed 5,000 people, and they asked them what they thought income distribution in the United States, what they thought it was. And of course, the respondents said that what they saw as income distribution was nowhere near what it actually is. And then these testers showed them a distribution that was fairly egalitarian. And the respondents said, oh, that probably is what the United States is like. And actually, it was Sweden's. It was Sweden's distribution. And then it's a wonderful YouTube. You can access this thing on YouTube, and it's almost funny if it wasn't so depressing. And the actual distribution of income in the United States is so mal-distributed that it's virtually in another world from Sweden's. So Americans think they live in Sweden, but they don't.
We're speaking with Ron Formisano, William Bryan Chair, Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Kentucky. His latest book, Plutocracy in America, How Increasing Inequality Destroys the Middle Class and Exploits the Poor. You liken income inequality in America to a spider web. What are some of the major strands of that web?
Well, we've been discussing them. Lower social mobility, diminished opportunity, the smashing of unions, the wage productivity gap. Smashing unions hurts the entire middle class because when unions are present, they not only provide better benefits and pay for their workers, but for any workers in factories or workplaces nearby, because there's always what they call the threat effect of unions. So employers are likely to make things better, even in a non-union shop. The flow of income upward, excess compensation in the executive suite. The United States having one of the worst paid labor forces among advanced countries. the relationship between inequality and unhealthiness, diminished political participation, the growing influence of billionaires, corporations, and the wealthy in public policy. I used a study that the Washington Post reporter did of 2 Florida counties right on the near the Atlantic coast. One, St. John's, filled with retirees, golf courses, bike trails, terrific beaches. Used to live in Florida. I know what those beaches are like. And then right next to it, Putnam County, where the median income was very, very low, and the poverty rate was very high, where diseases were very high. And there weren't many doctors. There were, per capita, quite a few doctors available in St. Johns County. Almost none in Putnam County. And I went through initially the profile of both of these counties in my book in relation simply to the quality of life and health. Of course, lower life expectancy. Significantly lower life expectancy in Putnam County, the poor county, right next door to St. Johns County. And then came a revelation later. I was doing research for my chapter on political participation. And there were studies, of course, of the botched elections in Florida, and even in the most recent elections, long waiting lines, even in 2012. And quite a few good studies by county studies of how these elections were managed. And then it just stood out like a bombshell. In St. Johns County, nobody waited in line. In Putnam County, they waited long hours to vote. The few who showed up, because it's a lesser participation rate. And of course, there were people there challenging the right of people to vote. So those, how much more starkly can we see the connections between all of those things: inequality, unhealthiness, diminished political participation? It's going on all over the United States. It's not just in Florida.
So how do we get back that American dream as a possibility for lower and middle income citizens? I mean, because everything you just described is obviously, if for lack of a better term, keeping the foot on the back of people's necks and keeping them down. So what do we do to change? How do we grow and move forward from this?
I like what you just said. Lots of people have a foot on their necks, that's for sure. Personally, I try not to use the politicians' BS phrase, American dream. The working poor and families getting by at around $25,000 a year would settle for a living wage, let alone the American dream. And not
right now, the American dream could be coming off of food stamps, right? I mean, as bad as things are, if I could just get to the point where I don't have to rely on.
That's another misconception about the working poor. There's a study done, marvelous study done by the same woman, Catherine Eden, who just published a book that I probably will mention later, $2 a day, 1.5 million people in this country living on $2 a day. And it was a study of single mothers. And what she showed was that these single mothers worked. They had jobs, but they also lied when they had to about getting food stamps, about getting other forms of assistance. They also lied about the fact that fathers, either married to them or not, often not, would help them somewhat. So they moved between work and welfare, and they had to take advantage of both to get by. That's who I'm talking about. These people would settle for a living wage.
Sure.
Now, the federal and state governments could help low and middle income families also by, I'm obviously talking, we need fair wages in this country. They could help by regulating or putting out of business the many predators that take advantage of the working poor. Payday loan shops, whose interest on debt can rise to 300, 400%. subprime auto loans, layaway plans, all designed to entrap borrowers in a cycle of debt. Gary Rivlin wrote a book called Broke USA, and he calls this the poverty industry, and he estimates it extracts from a worker supporting a family on $25,000 a year a 15% poverty tax. And when Rivlin wrote his book, he didn't consider the practices of towns like Ferguson, Missouri, that raise revenue. Second biggest source of revenue we all know now, I hope, in Ferguson was by giving tickets for minor traffic infractions, mostly to low-income African Americans, and charging them ridiculous court and other fees. Okay, what do we need to restore the middle class? What do we need to lift people up? We need, first of all, a government committed to full employment and protecting unions' right to collective bargaining. We need the repeal of right-to-work laws that are really right to work for less. We need to make, especially both federal and state tax systems fair and progressive, overturning Citizens United and more. State tax systems, 49 state tax systems, if you look at them, the combination of taxes that the population pays, low-income people, middle-income people pay more of their share of the tax revenue in 49 states than the 10% and the 1%. There's a study done every year by a tax and economic policy institute. This country needs a Congress. It needs state legislatures devoted to governing, and I'm sorry to say we are a long way off from that.
Okay. Now, before we let you go, we just have a couple minutes left. You wrote a book, For the People, about American populist movements that date to the Revolution. And then your latest book, which we've touched on today, Plutocracy, is about the ruling elites today. But weren't the founding fathers very well-off people complaining about taxes and demanding a voice in Parliament?
Oh, I love that question. You know, you're on dangerous ground here. You're talking to a historian. Firstly, I see the ruling elite.
I'm here to learn with everybody else.
Firstly, I see the ruling elite, I said this before, as a very diverse group of plutocrats enabled by a compliant political class. Now, about the founders. The founders didn't make the American Revolution all by themselves. They had help from founding mothers like Abigail Adams, and more so from middling and lower class people, artisans and farmers and sailors and mechanics, and a whole generation of historians who have written about the revolution from the bottom up, and of the broad participation of the non-gentry in the revolution would take exception to that phrasing. And so would those historians like Bernard Balin and Gordon Wood, who have written about what they call the Republican ideology of the elite leaders, and who have shown it was about much more than taxation and non-representation in Parliament. Now, many founders were indeed well off. Some of them had slaves, even in the North. But most of them believed that the survival of the Republic depended on a general equality of condition. And they believed that the middling part of the population should have a voice in government. And above all, they wanted to avoid the extremes of inequality that some of them witnessed on visits or diplomatic postings in Europe. Thomas Jefferson loved the culture of Europe, but he abhorred the extremes of inequality that he saw. And we've come a long way from that. And I would go so far to say that our political class has betrayed the founders' vision. I urge anyone to read the final passage in Bernard Balin's The Ideology of the American Revolution, which famously Daniel Ellsberg said when he read that final paragraph in a chapter called The Contagion of Liberty. He cried. I read it this morning, and I welled up a little, but I didn't cry.
Very good. Ron Formisano, William Bryan Chair, Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Kentucky, and his latest book, Plutocracy in America, How Increasing Inequality Destroys the Middle Class and Exploits the Poor. Ron, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back with us again soon.
It's been an honor, Jim. Happy to do it.
Thank you very much. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Political scientist Arthur Lupia has studied why people are ignorant on important issues and compares the electorate's decision-making to chimpanzees flipping coins. More on that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Question of the day. How many honeybees are in a beehive? Answer, 55,000. But who's counting? Matt Willey, for one, a highly regarded mural artist. He's been commissioned during the past couple of decades to grace the walls of homes and businesses. And now he's asking you and me to commission 20 new murals by him in various cities, with each wall-size painting being different versions of a common theme, the good of the hive. In particular, these murals will include a total of 50,000 hand-painted honeybees. Willie was motivated by a brief encounter with a single honeybee a few years ago. The tiny creature was crawling slowly across his rug. She was dying, he says, and for some reason I hung out with her until she died. This wholly unexpected spiritual connection with a bee prompted him to do a bit of research, finding that when a honeybee realizes it's sick and could infect the hive, it immediately departs, flying away to die, and to protect the health of the interconnected bee family. Bees don't just live in a hive, they are an integral, functioning part of it. The pulsing hive itself is alive, an organic body nurtured by and, in turn, nurturing every bee in the community. It dawned on Matt that this natural truth applies to our human communities as well. When we connect, we thrive, he realized, leading him to launch the Good of the Hive mural project. Using art, social media, film, music, and discussions, he and a happy band of travelers will swarm into communities for several weeks each to, 1, raise awareness about the unique importance as well as some special problems of bees, and 2, connect people to our human hive and the essential need to work for the good of all. This is Jim Hightower saying, to connect with Matt, the project, honeybees, and the idea of our shared community, go to thegoodofthehive.com.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Professor Arthur Lupia examines the behavior of American voters who are often ignorant about the issues facing them. He says when we have simple choices, you don't have to know anything. And we say hello to Arthur Lupia, political science professor at the University of Michigan and chair of National Research Council's Roundtable on the Application of Behavioral and Social Science. He is also the author of a new book, Uninformed: Why People Know So Little About Politics and What We Can Do About It. Arthur Lupia, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you with us. Progressives frequently bemoan that fact that Americans generally are ignorant about basic facts of government and politics. But you say all this so-called civic ignorance is not borne out by evidence. How so?
Well, when you ask people about politics, most people are very knowledgeable about aspects of politics that are important to them. part of the issue with the civic ignorance claims is you'll have someone like myself run a survey, and I'll ask questions that me and my friends wouldn't be caught dead not knowing. What percentage of the House and Senate are needed to override a veto, or who was the president of the United States in 1896. And so in my peer group, I have to know these or I'm embarrassing, but when I put them on surveys and the American public doesn't know it, then, the question is, what's the story after that? And often the story is, oh, the American public is ignorant of all these really important things. The problem is that we rarely look at whether the things we're asking people about are actually important to them, actually help them make better decisions, actually help them improve their quality of life. In my book, I go through a lot of evidence and show that, for the most part, the questions we're asking people about politics are things that are really important to some academics, are things that are really important to journalists, but tend not to be the types of things that are important to voters. So it's no shock that they don't know them.
It's often, you hear shocking numbers, shocking to me anyway, of people that don't accept, say, evolution or don't believe or understand the Holocaust. But do some of these surveys perhaps exaggerate ignorance by using faulty methodology?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. I mean, these are memorable headlines, right? That 50% of America, I even feel bad repeating them, so just for the audience, I'm about to show that they're false, but you'll have this headline every year that 50% of Americans don't believe in evolution, or there was a headline when the Holocaust Museum opened that 20% of Americans think the Holocaust didn't happen. And they make great headlines, and there are stories about how ignorant the public is and how terrible our education system is. The problem is, when you look at the data, you often find a pretty different story. So, for example, this Holocaust example is one I use in the book. So when the Holocaust Museum opened in Washington, the New York Times and lots of other outlets claim that 20% of the American public denied the Holocaust. That's a pretty serious thing. A headline, I clipped it out because I thought you'd ask me. Here's what the New York Times reported. They said a poll released yesterday found that 22% of adults and 20% of high school students thought it was possible that Nazi Germany's extermination of 6 million Jews never happened. In addition to the 22% of adult respondents who said it seemed possible that it never happened, 12% said that they didn't know. So those are shocking, shocking numbers. Here's the problem. It was the question. The question was horrible. Here's the question that was asked. It says, does it seem possible to you, or does it seem impossible to you, that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? So think about that question. If it seems possible to me that it never happened, I say yes. If it seems impossible to me that the Holocaust never happened, I say yes. People were confused about what it meant. So about 6 months later, the Gallup polling organization writes a more clearly worded version of the question where it's really clear. Do you think it happened? Are you sure it happened? Are you sure it didn't happen? And less than 1% of the American public denied the Holocaust, right? The problem is there were no headlines about that, right? So we keep the headlines. The same is true with evolution. It's a yearly headline. There's a fellow named Dan Kahan who's on the faculty at the Yale Law School. And what he shows is that when you ask somebody on a survey, do you believe in evolution, a lot of what they're telling you about is a cultural connection that they have. They're like, I'm not on that team, I'm on that team. But if you follow up and say, okay, then you give facts about the theory of evolution. You say, well, do you think most scientists believe that? It turns out a lot of people who say they don't believe in evolution, they understand what the theory is. They actually know what the theory of evolution is. They're telling you that they have a cultural commitment against those types of people who throw out evolution in their face all the time. So to really think about what people know, you've got to be careful when dealing with surveys. And unfortunately, a lot of media organizations tend to misrepresent surveys and go for the sensational claims about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, we see that all too often, that's for sure. We're speaking with Arthur Lupia, political science professor at the University of Michigan, author of a new book, Uninformed, Why People Know So Little About Politics and What We Can Do About It. You have a thought experiment in your new book about chimpanzees flipping coins to decide elections. Are they just as competent to vote as the American electorate?
Yes, I do have a chimp example in the book. So here's the idea. Suppose you had an electorate of chimps, and you gave each of them a coin, and they decided whether to vote Republican or Democratic, let's say, based on whether the coin landed heads or tails. So let's just say for the moment that there was a right answer for the chimps, that one of the two parties is actually better for chimps, and all the chimps flip a coin. if their coin is 51% likely to give them the right answer, and thousands or millions of chimps flip the coins, the way that statistics work is you're almost certain to get the right answer. So if you have like a million coin flipping chimps and all of their coins get the right answer 51% of the time, the probability of you getting the right answer is basically a dust speck away from 100%. So what I mean by that is when we have really simple choices like between two candidates, sometimes you don't have to know everything to make the right choice. You just have to know which is better than the other, as opposed to every element of President Obama's biography, for example. And moreover, if lots and lots of people just know what's better, then an electorate as a whole can make the decision they would have made had they known a lot. Now, if it's the case that people are suckered by certain false claims and that happens regularly, then this type of logic can fall apart. But as a general matter, if lots of people are knowledgeable, then an electorate as a whole can make a good decision, even though some people don't know as much.
Now, despite the messiness of elections and uncivil campaigning, do you think American voters generally get it right, at least in presidential elections?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Jim. And I think in politics, getting it right is often in the eye of the beholder. So if you have progressive values, you probably think that the American public got it right when they elected President Obama over Senator McCain or President Obama over Governor Romney. If you have conservative values, you probably think the American public got it wrong. So politics isn't a math test. Policies and ideas that benefit some people often impose costs on others. What I can say is that for major federal elections and also most governor elections, if you go back and interview voters a couple of years afterwards, and they say, do you think you made the right choice? Most people say yes. That's not determinative that they made the right decision, but it will tell you that many people, when they see what their elected candidates have done, a lot of them say, I think I did okay. I think getting it right is, the bigger issue is, if you're trying to build a coalition around a candidate or an idea, if you want other people to get it right, it's critical to understand their values. And so, when people criticize the outcome of the last presidential election, they say, look, the American public got it wrong. Often what they're criticizing is a set of values, as opposed to saying, well, there was, you got the wrong answer. If we want to build coalitions around candidates or ideas, we have to respect the other person's concerns and offer them information that can help them achieve their goals. So, in that sense, if getting it right means expanding a coalition, understanding the diverse values that participate in politics, that's a better way to do it.
Now, from a purely academic standpoint, how would you assess Donald Trump's message and his delivery of his message?
That's interesting. So I'm not the leading expert on Donald Trump. Right now his poll numbers in the mid-20s, and when there's 17 candidates in the race, that's enough to get you the lead. So a lot of people resonate with his personality. He most definitely is not a traditional politician, and a lot of people who are frustrated with how government works see a champion in him. So at that level, we're all talking about him, so there's success. But one thing to remember is that it's still really early in the race. 4 years ago at this time, we were focused on Michelle Bachmann. And 8 years ago at this time, Obama was still in single digits. In fact, I saw a C-SPAN, I saw a rerun of a C-SPAN show a couple months ago that was made in December of 2007. And it was great. It was really, really smart people, progressive people, and things of that nature. And everybody in the room knew that Hillary was going to be the nominee. So we're still really early. I think back to Trump, in general, he's doing a great job of conveying his message. We're all talking about him. What will be interesting is what will happen when some of the current Republican contenders drop out. So is his a message that tops out at 25% support of the public, or can he expand the set of people who want to support him? And, I know he takes a lot of controversial issues, but one thing to watch here is he's a Republican that's talking about tax increases and curtailing carried interest and things like that. So he might have a little more upside than people think. I don't know what it is, but I'd say, with 17 candidates in the race, if you're pulling 20s in the polls, you're just fine right now.
By the way, I wouldn't feel bad about not being a leading expert on Donald Trump, because I don't know that there is one. I just thought I'd throw that out there for you. There was a screenwriter once said in Hollywood, nobody knows anything. Isn't that true, though, not only in politics, but medicine, education, other professions?
So, in my work, I found that there are two groups of people. One group of people is almost entirely ignorant about almost everything that can be known, and the other group is delusional about how much they know. So I think that's the reality. But the fact is also that a lot of people know a lot of things that are of immediate importance to them in their lives. So, the world's a big place. There's lots of issues. Our brains have important limits. But if we want to educate people about politics or other matters, we can take that reality and do something really amazing. The key for us when we're trying to educate other people is to understand enough about them, what they want, what they need, what they value, to give them information that they will want to pay attention to, because that's the only way learning works. We can't really force people to learn unless, you're a school teacher. But when we're out in the public, when we're talking to neighbors and things like that, persuasion's an away game. People have to decide on their own to pay attention to what you're doing. So if you and I want to educate people, we have to give them information that they think tells their story, that they hear resonating with their beliefs. If we do that, we can be a way more effective communicator. And by being an effective communicator, we can really empower people and change their lives. The point of the book I'm writing is to show people how to do that.
Arthur Lupia, a political science professor at the University of Michigan. You want to check out the new book, Uninformed, Why People Know So Little About Politics and What We Can Do About It. Arthur, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We enjoyed it very much, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Cameron Joseph of the New York Daily News.
So, Cameron, I want to start with the front page of the Daily News. The cover of the Daily News yesterday is your article, at any rate, about this incredible story. Terrorist people who are on the no-fly zone, no-fly list, right, in this country. So they're suspected terrorists, yet they can legally buy a gun?
Yep, that has no prohibitions on them. When you talk about background checks, it doesn't get factored in. And they've been trying to pass a law since 2007, bipartisan legislation since 2007, to close that loophole and make sure that, if you've been flagged as a possible terrorist, you can't legally just walk into a Walmart, say, and just buy a gun and have that be totally legal, totally not problematic, and have no hiccups, and they would have no idea that you're on this list. Now, granted, the terror watch list isn't perfect. There's a lot of people on there that might not, that probably shouldn't be. It's up to like 1 million people. But at the same time, it seems like, it should at least raise a flag, have them look a little deeper into who this person is and why they're trying to buy guns and ammunition.
One would think so. So where's the opposition come from?
Take a guess. It's the NRA, and they won't let it through. They fought it tooth and nail, and you can make an argument about the issues with the terrorist watch list, but they're basically saying, no, this is just an impingement on the one amendment we care about. And I was up on the Hill this week, and Dianne Feinstein's the main sponsor in the Senate, and she's talking about, we're going to push for hearings in the Senate, and we're going to get this in front of Judiciary. I'm writing a letter to the Republican chairman. We'll see if that happens or not. But Peter King is the Republican from Long Island who has been backing this for years, and I asked him about this. I was like, look, after Paris, is there any chance this is going to come up? And he just rolled his eyes. He's like, this is a non-starter. We're never getting this done in the Congress, with the Republican Congress. Basically, he said there's 5 Republican co-sponsors. That's not nearly enough. And, with the NRA against this and Republicans in control, something that I think a lot of people would see as fairly common sense. And there's, civil libertarian arguments against it. It's just a complete non-starter, and there's probably not even a real debate about it.
If I were a lobbyist for the NRA, I would find it hard to explain why terrorists need, I wouldn't find it hard to explain why terrorists need guns, but why it's a good idea to allow terrorists or suspected terrorists to buy guns openly in this country.
Yeah, and maybe that's the reason they didn't get back to us on this story. But although the NRA does have a particular issue with the Daily News because we tend to support, some modest gun proposals, but they just don't even talk to us anymore. But I think this is one of those things. You even see like school shootings. You see Wayne LaPierre yelling about how you want to see more guns in schools so that people can fire back and limit the damage. We haven't really seen that argument here. So it's I think telling that even the NRA doesn't want to talk about why they oppose this, but I also think that it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it opens up a real interesting dynamic and discussion about, okay, where is the line between civil liberties and protecting the whole country. And we're seeing a lot of discussions on other fronts right now about, well, should we lock things down? Should we give up some of our rights to be able to protect ourselves? Right. Obviously, the refugee thing has become a huge political football. But this is not one that we've seen a ton of discussion about until we raised it, and it seems like a lot of people are going, "What? This is the law right now?" People are just shocked that it even could be, something that was going on right now. So
it fits the NRA playbook in opposition to any restriction whatsoever, even if it makes eminent sense, right?
Yeah.
They're opposed to it.
Yeah, and that's where they come down on this. And strategically, it makes sense because if they drag their feet on this and they fight this, and even if this goes through, it takes years, which it has. It's been almost a decade since this was first introduced by a now dead senator in 2007. If we're fighting about this, that we're not really fighting over some of background checks or anything else they actually really hate. And so I'm not saying there aren't policy arguments for and against this bill. The terrorist watch list is not perfect. But this seems like a gimme, and this isn't going to happen. And I think that says where the Congress is right now.
It also relates to something that we talked about earlier in the program this morning, which is the very same people who are rising up in arms saying, we need tougher background checks on these Syrian refugees, even though the process today takes 18 months to 2 years, and is like the head of World Relief told us earlier in the program, it's a 14-step program, and they have to go through all of these 14 hoops, 5 of which are directly related to national security with the FBI and the DHS and everybody involved in it. And the people who are saying, well, that's not enough. We need tougher background checks for these Syrian refugees. Don't want any background checks at all when it comes to buying a gun.
Yeah, there's a little bit of hypocrisy there. I think it's notable that I forget who it was, but it was a Texas Republican politician this week made an argument against letting refugees in because it's so easy to buy guns here.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, that is.
Isn't that great? It's just an amazing story.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, well, which of these two problems should we be addressing right now? That it's like, okay, you made a point. Yeah, it's easy to get guns here.
Yeah, he's not wrong.
Yeah,
yeah,
right. So, I mean, I think it's interesting to see how this discussion's going, and frankly, if you're ISIS and you actually want to, wreak terror and get an attack in, you're not going to try and squeeze through a widow or orphan who's going to take 2 years and probably isn't going to get into the U.S. anyways through a refugee program that's very stringent already. You're probably going to pick one of the people who has a U.S. passport or has an EU passport who can easily get here. And I mean, the idea that blocking 10,000 refugees, which is already pretty small number. We're talking about 10 million people displaced by the conflict in Syria. We're talking, barely 1% of that. That somehow that's going to create a problem. And we didn't really hear all these complaints and concerns about all the Iraqi refugees that came in after we invaded Iraq and they needed somewhere to go. And, we heard some people on the right grumbling about it, but it wasn't like this. It wasn't about shutting down the program. And so, I think it's notable where we are.
Yeah, Peter, you were mentioning there's a mayor in Virginia, I believe, yesterday.
Roanoke, I believe. Yeah, who brought up the idea that we've had this problem before with Japanese people that were here, and we just put them in internment camps, so no big deal.
Yeah.
Right? We can go back to that.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, and he's a Democrat, notably.
Yeah, so he is. It's a good point.
Bipartisanship doesn't know D or R, or idiocy can really spread across the country.
No, and
And to her credit, Hillary Clinton said, all right, you're off my leadership team. Now, it's interesting he's on the leadership team in the first place. But it's, I think, interesting. People look back at this, and I take this a little personally because, as a Jew with distant relatives who died in the Holocaust, we couldn't get in. My family couldn't get in. So
there's a viral story going around now about how Otto Frank, father of Anne Frank, tried to get to America. We declined. We said no thanks.
So would you do me a favor when you leave here? Would you call Chuck Schumer and remind him, that where he came from and he's out now calling for a pause in the Syrian refugee program.
I was standing there, and I think that was slightly misreported. I mean, what he said is we might need a temporary pause as we look at the whether all of these checks are working. He was basically saying we're going into this briefing. I want to see how this program is working once we get our private briefing. And they're like, well, somebody was like, well, okay, you're not talking about a total pause in the program like McConnell and like Paul Ryan are talking about, but if this isn't where it needs to be, do you think there should be a temporary pause while you fix it, basically? And then he's like, yes, I think there might, there's a possibility that there's a, small chance there might need to be a pause. And of course, the Republicans took that quote and blasted it everywhere. I'm not saying he was gung ho firing back against the Republicans' efforts to end this refugee program, but at the same time, like what he was reported to have said. I mean, I was standing right in front of him when he said it. Is not what he said.
I'm glad you clarified that because he was on my list there for a while. With Cameron Joseph from the Daily News. Cameron, you've been covering the political scene. Who on the Republican side benefits most from this shift to foreign policy?
I think Marco Rubio does. He's really gone very hawkish. He sounds very intelligent on this, and he really is in a position where this is exactly what he wants to be talking about, and frankly what he's been talking about for the last 18 months to 2 years, and re-injected himself into this presidential race with, when we were talking about the issues in Ukraine, and then right after Jeb Bush made his big splash, Rubio got right back into the news cycle talking about Cuba. He's knowledgeable about this. This gets the neocons on his side, and frankly, Jeb Bush, every time he talks about this, people just think of his brother, and that's not always helpful. So I think Marco Rubio is the big winner on the GOP side with this.
And not Ben Carson.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Ron Formisano, Arthur Lupia, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.